Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Heads Up King course. In today's video, I'm going to talk about single raise pots in position and give you my approach into understanding how to construct a balanced game plan post-flop. Now, first of all, why it is important to be balanced. If you think about the game of poker, it is basically a massive tree, and this massive tree has so many different branches, and these branches represent lines that are taking that the hand can take. For example, in heads up PLO, you can open raise the button and your opponent calls. Now you're entering a certain part of the game tree. Then you can bet the flop and your opponent might call. You can bet the turn and he might fold. And that is where that branch ends. And there are so many of these branches in poker that we have to understand, and have to understand how to play balanced. Now the reason for that is if you are unbalanced in any sort of part of the game tree, your opponent gets to notice and then gets to take advantage of you whenever he reaches this branch. Another problem is that when you are unbalanced in one part of the game tree, it also automatically means you're unbalanced in another part where you are, let's say, for example, oversee betting the flop. It means that your check back range might also be insufficiently protected. Now, in 6-max PLO, the game tree is really massive, and that is because there are multiple players on the table and there's so many different ways the hand can go. It is very difficult to actually understand where an opponent is exactly unbalanced and where not. But that's much different than heads up PLO because the game tree is so much smaller. You're either in the small blind or in the big blind. You're playing a single raise pot or a 3-bet pot, and that's pretty much it. Now in 6-max PLO, you might play a single raise pot from early position against the button, from early position against the small blind or the big blind. You might play multi-way pots. You might play 3-bet pots against one specific range and another 3-bet pot against a completely different range, and that doesn't really happen in heads up PLO. The 3-betting ranges you're going to face are almost always going to be very, very similar, around 18%. The open raising range will be very, very similar, and for that reason, it's much faster and easier to understand where your opponent is actually unbalanced. Now, another reason why it's easier to notice is that you're only playing against one player. So you really have time to think about how is this player approaching the game. Is he over c-betting, under c-betting? Is he under double barreling the turn? Is he unbalanced on the river for some sort of reason? And it's much easier and quicker to realize these mistakes of being unbalanced in a heads-up game where you can really zone in on one opponent only. On all of his stats, you can see all the showdowns and take notice of his strategy. Now, by understanding how you become more balanced, you're also aware to spot the situations where your opponent is unbalanced. Imagine, for example, let's say you would know what the average c-bet frequency would be in a single raise pot. If you know what it would be, you can actually notice if your opponent is way over it or under it and then take advantage of that by exploiting him. And once again, these stats build up much quicker in heads up PLO than in 6-max PLO because the button RFI happens every second hand basically, where in a 6-max game, you could be in any seat and face an open raiser, while that's not possible in heads up PLO when you are on the button, respectively in the small blind. So, thinking about a game tree and thinking about how to become the master of that game tree is specifically interesting in heads up PLO because there's less to manage and less to master. And also there is a bigger reward at the end of the tunnel because when you understand how to play the game tree very strongly and balanced, you're able to take advantage of your opponents in a much better way because you only play against this one player and you're able to notice so many leaks so quickly. Let's head into, first of all, the possible different lines that the hand can go down. Now, we're going to talk about single raise pots in position today. So there are obviously only a few ways the hand can go in this situation. Here is a listing of all the possible lines that we need to understand and we need to master in terms of balancing our range. This is the way the hand can go. So we open raise pre-flop and we're going to assume our opponent always checks to us, which is going to be very frequently the case when you look at the meta game. Now, the hand can go bet, 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 which means we are betting the flop, we're betting the turn, we're betting the river. It could go bet, bet, check. We're betting, betting, and checking. It could go bet, check, bet. It could go bet, check, 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 bet, bet, check, bet, check, and then check, check, bet, and check, check, check. These are all the possible lines that we can take. Now, of course, our opponent might bet into us or raise us on the flop, but if we have these lines covered, we are able, and they are all balanced, then we're able to react to all those leads or flop raises or turn raises in a proper, balanced, good way. So these are basically the lines that we need to understand and we need to lay out in our game plan in order to master the game. Let's talk about these lines. Every line has a set amount of combos that belongs to this part of the game tree, which means when you think about an individual combo in the game, you should think about which line is the best line to take with this specific hand for my overall range and for this specific holding. And we're going to look into some examples today to understand this concept better. Second, every line has its own challenges and difficulties when it comes to reaching balance within that part of the game tree. For example, the bet line has its own challenges. Can you come up with enough bluffs? Can you come up with enough value hands by the time you reach the turn in the river? And also, are you balanced in all the possible different outcomes the board can take? And thirdly, all lines together create a complete balanced game plan, which means when you understand how to balance all these different lines correctly, you have a solid game plan post-flop, which is our ultimate goal. Let's have a look at an example of a way a hand can go down and part of the game tree, a branch the hand can go down basically. We're going to look at the bet line and see what the challenges and difficulties are in order to truly understand how to play this part of the game tree. We're going to look at the board of ace, king, 5, two-toned. You can see the board in the top right corner. And we're going to look at the GTO frequency on average with our overall range. Now on the flop, we can either check or bet, and we are going to check 48% at a time and bet 52% at a time. Now, what are the challenges here in play when we make this decision? First of all, when we check with our checking range, we have to make sure that we are protected against turn and river aggression. So we have to check back enough good hands that can still call a turn bet and or a river bet. If we're not making sure we have enough good hands in our check back range, our opponent has a very easy time to exploit us. And that is when we are checking back on the flop, he's going to take a ton of turn steps and just win the hand, even with very low EV or low equity hands. Next up, we have thin value hands that we want to still bet on the turn the river. And we want to make sure that these are in our hand so that we can also represent value hands when we check back the flop and then turn. On the turn we're going to bet or on the river we're going to bet, we still have to have some value hands in here. And in order to balance these value hands, we have to make sure to also include some bluffs. Hands that are not betting the flop but are checking back and then bluffing at a later stage. Next up, when we see bet, our challenges here are mainly that we first of all want to bet because we have a strong made hand or a draw and we want to get some value from these hands. Pretty straightforward. Next up, we want to see bet hands that are pretty weak, and they have higher EV betting than checking, and that could be because either they have low equity and doesn't really make too much sense checking them back, or we have good blockers down the road. But one thing to realize is that not all hands that have low equity have a higher EV betting, because if we start betting all of our hands that have no future blockers and no equity in the pot, not even marginal equity, we will start way over bluffing, and once again that is a very unbalanced way of playing the game and is easily exploitable, specifically in heads-up PLO. And thirdly, we want to balance our value ranges by including enough bluffs in our betting range. That's really where a lot of people are struggling. In 6-max PLO as well as in heads-up PLO, they are too merged on the flop, which means too many hands are betting the flop that should be checking in order to achieve a different goal, which is the goal of being protected when you check back, and too many hands that should be betting in order to bluff at a later stage because they really care about being balanced. They are not bluffing on the flop or the turn, and then end up with an unbalanced ratio of value bluffs when they barrel a second time or a third time. Now, what the big challenge here is that these goals that we have here with betting and checking have to be addressed on all possible runouts across the board. So that means if the turn is a complete blank card, we have to be able to defend properly after checking back. If the turn is a spade, if the turn is a diamond, if the turn is a straightening card, we have to be able to have enough value and bluff hands in order to play a strategy where we are still betting and we're still able to call down in case we're not betting. And that's the big challenge in poker in general, but it's easier to address in heads-up PLO. Just think about all the possible and relevant runouts and then understand that both of your ranges, the checking and betting range, need to be able to play a good, solid, balanced strategy on all these possible runouts. So on this board, for example, we have to be able to call down after checking back on diamonds. How do we do that? Well, clearly we should check back some of the diamond hands. We have to be able to have some nut flushes on some diamond runouts so we can actually represent a very strong hand when we bet and we avoid getting raised all the time. We have to be able to triple barrel here with enough bluffs on straightening cards. So we have some good straightening blockers. We have to be able to triple barrel here with some diamond blockers, and therefore we want to include them into our flop betting range. Like all these runouts that are relevant and possible need to be covered in bluffs and in value hands in all branches of the tree, which means when we are betting, when we are checking as well. Next up, on the turn here, we can double barrel or check now and see a river card, and we can see that we are double barreling the turn 44% of the time in this specific flop across all the possible turn cards. Now you can see that the frequency here is not 30%, it's not 75%, and the turn frequency in heads up PLO is extremely important. And here are a couple reasons why. The second barrel from in position is extremely important. By not betting the turn at a high frequency, we allow our opponent to take a very profitable stab on the river, at least against most strategies, which can lead him to float many flops to bluff us on rivers after checking back on the turn. What does this mean? The following. If we have a strategy that bets the flop very frequently and then checks back on the turn, we give our opponent a great chance to lead the river and have a very profitable stab. And if he recognizes that we are a player that is betting the flop too often, checking the turn very frequently, then he can float the flop very light. He can start calling a ton of flops and see if we follow up, and if we don't, he's going to turn a lot of hands into a bluff. Once again, this is a big part of our goal to avoid that our opponent can do things like float light out of position, specifically in heads up PLO, where he is able to notice very quickly whether or not we are double barreling at a proper frequency, or if we are bet and being done way too frequently, which a lot of players are. Next up, the turn card is where most players won't bluff enough, which leads to unbalanced river ranges. So in this specific example, on ace king 5, I often see players, when they reach a turn, they are double barreling mainly with equity in mind. They think, well, if we turn a flush draw, if we have a flush draw, if we have a hand that has a lot of equity and can still get there, I'm going to use that combo in order to bluff the turn because I can still get there. But that's an easy recipe to actually be under bluffing the river cards. You have to think about the river already and include hands into your double barreling range that its pure function is to be able to have a healthy ratio on the turn and on the river when it comes to bluffing and value hands. So by not only sticking to equity, you're going to be making sure that you have enough bluffs on the turn and the river, and that's where most people fall short. Next back, our check back range on the turn has to be able to call rivers across the board to avoid wide floating. Once again, when we reach the turn card and we check back, we have to make sure that we can call and defend enough river cards where our opponent is not incentivized to turn way too many hands into bluffs. I see this mistake happening all the time in heads up PLO. People bet and then give up. And for me, as a big blind player, it is very easy to just call the flop, see what happens, and then bluff the river. On the river here, we are triple barreling now 47% of the time and checking back 53% of the time. What are the challenges here? Well, when our opponent calls twice and doesn't raise, he often shows up with busted draws and capped mate hands. At this point, it is important to keep the pressure on and high in barrel in order to take advantage of our big polarized distribution, or a big advantage in polarized distribution. We want to bet big on the river here for a triple barrel, and we want to make sure to follow up pretty frequently. Now, if you want to check back a street, it would be the river. And the reason is, if you check the turn, your opponent gets to stab the river. And again, that's very often super profitable because we have a very capped range, most players have, when they check back the turn. But if you check back the river in position, the hand is over and you go to showdown. So the idea of betting the flop with hands that can double barrel the turn very frequently is a good idea because your opponent is not able to take a river lead. At least not on those cards. On some other cards, of course, the texture will change. Your opponent might lead into you very often for value, but that's really not as big of a deal as checking back the turn very frequently and then folding to a river stab. You're allowing your opponent to take a profitable river stab where you don't do that when you double barrel flop and turn and then check back river with more marginal hands. Next up, I want to connect different strength buckets on the ace king 5 flop and talk about how these are connected with different branches the hand can go. So basically, some hands are very much optimized to go for a bet, bet, bet. Some hands, they're optimized to go for a bet, bet, check, or a check, check, call. And I want to get your mind on this idea that when you look at a hand, you have to connect it with a certain line and understand where it fits in the most in order to be the most efficient hand it can be in your overall range. I talked about this idea about efficiency before, and I think it is very smoothly integratable when it comes to heads up PLO because the game tree is so much smaller. So for that matter, let's head into different flop strengths buckets. We can see on the left-hand side, bottom left, are the strongest hands and then become weaker and weaker. First, we're going to talk about sets, two pair with backup, and strong draws. Now, these hands are mainly going to be used in order to play a bet, bet, bet line or a bet, bet, check line if the river changes the board quite significantly in our disadvantage. Hands like King, King, 10, 5 here, middle set, for example, is a great hand to be betting the flop, betting the turn, and either checking the river or betting the river, depending on what the card is, of course. But these hands, generally speaking, sacrifice too much value by being in any other line because they want to generate value, as they can clearly beat a hand at showdown that is bluff catching, like ace king or ace 5 or any sort of other two pair that comes down by the river. We also have the backdoor non-flush draw, which definitely helps as well. Next up, medium draws, top pair plus and top pair minus. Let's talk about medium draws first of all. Hands like queen, jack, 8, 9 are hands that are definitely well suited to bet the flop because they have low equity when checking back, but they have high nuttiness going to the turn card, but also have good blockers in order to increase the EV in a bloated pot. So this hand can definitely go bet, bet, bet. Imagine the turn would be a 7 of spades. We want to bet again. The river is potentially a diamond. This could be a good hand to go for a triple barrel. We could also make the nuts in a 10, or we can river a backdoor flush and go for bet, bet, bet once again. Another hand in the same, or in the next bracket, is basically a top pair plus is ace, queen, jack, 7. So top pair, not flush draw and not gut shot. Like this hand, generally speaking, goes bet, bet, check in case we don't improve. So if we only have one pair by the river, or a hand like ace 7. But if we make a flush or if we make a straight, of course, we're going to go ahead and bet, bet, and bet once again. This hand is not going to be used in order to bet, bet, bluff. It is mainly a hand that wants to generate value. And then in comparison to like ace 10, 9, 5, here we have the ace of diamonds. This hand will also go bet, bet, check in case we don't improve to a blocker, or it goes bet, bet, bet in case we do make the fake flush here with the ace of diamonds. But I want you guys to look at this hand and think about, well, where does this hand fit in very well? In which part of the game tree is it going to do very well? And this hand clearly does very well when the pot is very large, because we can leverage the ace of diamonds so strongly, but at the same time we can generate some value by betting the flop as well. Next up, we have here ace 10, 9, 5, for example. So this is the same hand, but we don't have the ace of diamonds. This is clearly a hand that goes into our checking range because it functions well as a check back, call, call, or a check back, call, fold, or it functions well as a check back, bet, bet. Generally speaking. So a great bluff catcher, so to speak, a hand that wants to generate value over 1 or 2 streets. But realize if you put this hand, for example, into your betting range, what hands are going to check back and then call down at a balanced frequency? And if the answer is not enough, then your opponent is able to pick up on that very, very quickly. And I want you guys to pick up on these ideas and pick up on these false, or not necessarily false, but unbalanced frequencies of your opponents. Because if your opponent is c-betting hands like this on this flop, then most likely his check-back range will be unbalanced in a way that you can take advantage of. Next up, we're going to talk about weak draws. Weak draws, your main betting lines are going to be either check back and give up. You can see the split here is around 50-50, green and blue bars. But some of the hands are betting. A hand like 2, 2, 3, 6, for example, is betting the flop. If it does connect to the turn by having blockers or a straight or a set or a flush draw, we're going to go for a double barrel, generally speaking, then triple barrel in some of the runouts, or give up on some of the turns or rivers. So this is a hand that definitely can bet the flop, can bet some of the turns, can triple barrel some of the river depending on the run out, but it goes into both categories. This type of hand is better suited towards betting, and then other weak draws that don't have as many future blockers or not at runouts like this one, a deuce or a 4 is obviously very strong cards, are generally better off just going to go ahead and check and give up. And then they go into a check back range that checks and folds, or checks and delays c-bet bluffs on the turn on the river. Next up, we have top pair minus and air. So these are two different hands, but they have similar lines here. We have check fold definitely in there. So top pair could go ahead and check back and fold to turn bet some of the time. Specifically, air is going to do that. But if we have additional side cards that are helpful, like a future blocker or a gut shot, then these hands could be betting. So with the air portion, it could be like a backdoor straight draw with a high diamond on this board. With top pair, it could be top pair that has a good straight blocker or a spade or a diamond blocker that we're going to start betting on the flop in order to potentially turn into a bluff. But very often these hands are being used to check back, trying to get the showdown and give up. Ace jack 9-8, for example, is a great hand to check back. It can call turn bets. It can turn itself into a value hand on some spade runouts, or if we turn a jack and the turn goes check check, and then we can value bet the river or hero call the river against an opponent's bet as well. So this hand fits well into a checking range in order to protect your checking range. And I see just way too many players just thinking about the game trees in a more simplified way. They don't really take too much attention or pay too much attention to all the game trees that are possible, the check backs and then double check backs and the double bets and the double checks and then delay river bluffs. They don't really think about how to balance in these parts of the ranges. They're just way too much focused on the flop in itself. And the problem is, if you're unbalanced on the flop, it is basically impossible to not be unbalanced on the later streets, because you don't take the combos with you that you need in order to reach balance. And lastly, we have middle pair plus here and middle pair minus. These hands are generally speaking going to check a lot of the time, so we already have some showdown value. We want to see additional cards. Specifically, we have middle pair plus. The general lines are going to start off with a check back, and then we're going to call a turn sometimes, or our hand turns into a value hand like a flush draw, and we're going to bet the turn or bet the river. But generally speaking, we're going to kick it off with a check, and then our hand rolls into a value bet or a bluff catcher. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the introduction of the game trees. I want you guys to think more about these branches and look into your hold'em manager and think about, does your frequencies make sense? Which means when you check back, how often are you folding against a turn stab? How much do you fold if the river gets stabbed as well? How often are you capable of bet calling the flop? How often do you double barrel, or do you leave your opponent a big chance of actually floating the river or floating the flop and betting the river, stabbing the river into you successfully? Check out these frequencies and try to understand if you're pretty well protected and balanced in your overall game plan. And then once you start playing against other players, you realize their leagues much faster and start playing more into the league branches of the game plan, which means if a player is, for example, over folding against a delay c-bet, so he's not balanced enough in a check-check range in the big blind, then I'm going to start checking more towards this part of the game tree and take advantage of him in parts of the game tree where he is unbalanced. So I'm forcing a lot of the action into the parts of the game tree where my opponent is weak, and that's called taking advantage of weaknesses. Leave it with that idea. See you in the next video, guys, here in the Heads Up King course.